Thank you. Today's issue is public education. I think that there are a couple of ways to sort of frame public education. First of all, it's big, right? Public education represents roughly 50% of the appropriated budget in the biennium. Public education touches every single House and Senate district in the great state of Texas. We have something like 5 million kids in the public education system in Texas. Public education is big. The second thing is that public education is complicated. And by complicated, I mean that public education, if you look at the education code in the law, both the funding part of public education and the regulatory part of public education are just amazingly thick in terms of the language that is used, in terms of the funding formulas, which some of you may have heard of. When I got my first work in public education, I was hired to do a very small little sliver of a thing for a public education entity for the Texas Association of School Boards. And I said, well, as long as I'm working for you guys, let me learn something about how you're funded, the finance. And I was told by the people in public education, oh, you'll never be able to learn that. It's impossible. Which I find kind of interesting, right? Because it's always scary when you have something that is extremely important to the life of the state and touches directly or indirectly, and more often than not directly, every single person in Texas. And yet you are told this thing is impossible to understand. So I got upset when I was told that I would never be able to understand it. And I said, by golly, I'll learn to understand it. And I found out, yeah, it's actually really complicated and it's hard to understand, but not impossible. What's important about public education are some basic fundamental concepts. What I'd like to do with you today is talk about two things, or two large sets of things. One is, what is the challenge in any particular legislative session for and to public education? And the parts of those challenges and what they mean. And then the second thing is, what are the basic concepts that are important to understand when you're actually going to talk to people about public education at the Capitol? Does that sound like a good organizational structure? Okay. With regard to the challenges in a legislative session, there are four sort of macro buckets, four big categories of bills related to public education in any particular legislative session, including this one. The first one is funding. And that is funding in the context of the structure that's currently on the books, right? We have a public education funding system. And the fundamental question is, how much money is going into that system? And as you fund the different parts of the system, how does that have an effect on the system overall, right? This is typically found in the big appropriation bills, right? The Senate Bill 1, House Bill 1, those big bills that are related to the funding of the great state of Texas. Article 3 of the funding bills includes funding of the Texas Education Agency, and through the public school funding formulas, the funding of public education in Texas. So when you're looking at things in the legislature, when you're looking at notices, for instance, if you looked at a hearing notice today, you would see that in the House, the House subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee, the Appropriations Subcommittee on Article 3 is meeting right now while we're speaking. And what that constitutes is a work group that is meeting about the funding of public education. Article 3 also includes higher education and the Texas School for the Deaf and the Texas School for the Blind and lots of other education-related activities. But the big meat of the Article 3 working group on the Appropriations Committee is education, public education, how the schools in every community in this state get funded. Does that make sense? Okay. So the idea there is that there will be at the end of the day, there will be an agreement between the House and the Senate on how much money will go into the current structure of funding. And lots of people have strong opinions about that. Okay, that's number one. Number two, are bills related to actually changing the structure of public school funding, right? So occasionally we have reforms. Those reforms are typically actually accomplished or manifested if the courts say we must. The last time we had a court-ordered reform of the public education financing system was after West Orange Cove in 2005 and 2006. You all may remember we had several special sessions and ultimately had a change in funding pattern because the courts had ruled that our funding structure for public education was not living up to the constitutional mandate of the general diffusion of knowledge, right? Right now, there are proposals in both the House and the Senate for a change in the public school funding structure. However, we are not under any particular court mandate. There was a celebrated lawsuit that has been pending up until this session for the past several years. And at the end of the day, the Texas Supreme Court found that our system is not in violation of the Constitution, but close. So you get this strange warning language from the court saying you could slip over the line to this thing being unconstitutional any time now, but right now it's okay. If there is not a mandate from the court to change the public education funding structure, it's a lot harder to change it. Because if you change it, a lot of times that includes revenue. And it is a hard thing to get a legislature to increase revenue unless they are being absolutely mandated to do so on the scale that we're talking about. This goes back to point one that's very important. Public education is big. So when you move the funding of pub ed just a few percentage points, you're moving the state budget. If you move the pub ed funding space 2 percentage points, right? 2% more revenue, and you've got to come up with that revenue. That means that you're increasing the overall budget by a percentage point. You're spending half, right? So it's a big deal to get more funding for public education because it's so darn huge. That makes sense? So if that second bucket is a change in the structure of funding, those things are hard to do. But the court did say that we are so close to it that I think that the legislature is taking a real, sincere look at what they might be able to do with the funding structure. There are other issues related to the funding structure. How many of you have heard of Chapter 41 and Chapter 42 schools? This is super important. This goes to the equalization of wealth, the distribution of resources from more property wealthy school districts to less wealthy school districts. A Chapter 41 school is a school that has a lot of wealth per pupil, more wealth than a threshold set by the state. So for instance, for those of you in the Austin area, Eanes Independent School District is a Chapter 41 school district, right? Clearly, it's got high property wealth per student. And so it is a place that gets a lot of money for its local tax effort. Chapter 42 school might be one down in the valley or somewhere else where there's not very much property value per pupil. Chapter 42 schools receive money from Chapter 41 schools. The popular name for this is Robin Hood, right? So the numbers that I'm saying are just the actual legal definitions of what creates Robin Hood. You are designated by virtue of the math in your district and the wealth of your property as a Chapter 41 or a Chapter 42 school, and money changes hands between Chapters 41 and 42. Here's what's interesting, is that increasingly we've had this increases in property wealth in Texas, and as a result, because of the mathematical functions in statute, more and more school districts are being designated as Chapter 41 schools and having to export some of their wealth to other school districts, even if those schools have tremendous needs. I'll give you an example. Austin Independent School District is a Chapter 41 school district. right? So it moves wealth out of Austin. And yet, are there very difficult needs in Austin Independent School District? Yes. Are they serving a tremendous number of people who qualify for free and reduced lunch and at-risk kids? Absolutely. Are they serving a very large minority population with particular needs? Yes. So this movement of the structure so that increasingly districts that really can't afford to export wealth are being called upon to do so by the old math in the statute that's been there for a long time, this is a problem. Houston ISD is on the verge of becoming a Chapter 41 school district. Dallas ISD is on the verge of becoming a Chapter 41 school district. Okay, sir.
When was that structure put in place?
The structure was originally put in place in 1993. This was, the author of it was then Senator and later Lieutenant Governor Bill Ratliff, who created the first Robin Hood type statute. And then it has been tweaked from time to time between now and then, but that was when the major framework went in. I give you this story to illustrate the fact that this structure of public school funding is living in a moving world. And so you can't make one that's perfect, though the legislature would like to, because it's really complicated, and every time they open it up, there are winners and losers in the districts, right? So it's very tough, and and I say that with real sympathy for the legislature when they try to deal with this, because this is because, again, public education is so big. It touches on the political structures in a representative's or a senator's district. It touches on the financial structures. It touches on the basic community expectations. It's really got a lot of hooks in it for policymakers, right? A lot of times you'll see something if you see a big change in the public school structure, it's so difficult and complicated to figure out how it works in the context of the actuarial realities of the structure that members have to have what they call runs. And the runs are simply these big charts that say, will my school district get more or less money if we do this thing, if we do a redistribution of the wealth in a school bill, right? And so it's a joke we have, you know, where everybody's waiting for the runs, and there are about 5 guys in Texas who can actually produce the runs for the legislature, and then everybody freaks out when they get them, and it's super exciting in the Capitol. But, so that's bucket number 2, is the structure of funding. Bucket number 3 in public education is the actual Workaday Regulation of public education itself. All of those bills that affect curriculum, all of those bills that affect staffing, all of those bills that affect issues related to everything from discipline issues in the schools to staff problems in the schools. Right now, there is a raft of bills in the legislative session related to inappropriate relationships between parents and teachers, because there have been some sadly celebrated cases. I'm sorry, I said parents and teachers. Teachers and students, forgive me, between teachers and students. And there have been some terrible, I'm so upset by it, I guess I can hardly say it. But, and it is, these are terrible instances that happen where teachers abuse the trust and authority that they have and have inappropriate relationships with underage kids. Those things engender, rightly, a legislative response, but that legislative response has to be both effective and workable and fair, right, in the context. And so there are a bunch of bills related to this. There are lots of bills related to specific curriculum. For instance, there are several bills related to mandatory teaching of the founding documents of the United States of America. A lot of the teachers that I know would argue we do that. It's called government. So the question is, why would there be bills like this? They're in response to an idea, a popular concept that we're not teaching our kids about America. And so our response will be bills that require that you teach about America and the founding documents. The question is this a real problem or is it not a real problem? And the answer is the democratic process, where you do research and you have people come and witness and testify, and you get to the truth of this thing about whether or not we are teaching our kids about America or not in schools, right? And there are, when I say there are a lot of bills, I'm talking about hundreds, and we'll wind up with thousands. We'll wind up with well over 1,000 bills related to public education and its operation, right? Every time I open up my computer, there's a new set of filings that have to do with public education, and I dutifully put them in my track for public ed, and every time I put them in my track, I realize, wow, it's like now I have to make 10 tracks inside this track to really figure out what's going on, because there are so many bills, okay? So that was bucket number 3, right? Number 1 is basic funding. Number 2 is structure of funding. Number 3 is the actual regulation of school. Number 4 is the interplay between public schools and private schools in the space. That is usually expressed by the term voucher. But it also relates to charter schools, and it relates to education savings accounts, which are in play this legislative session. Whether or not we are going to, in various kinds of ways, large and small, privatize parts of our public education in the context of moving public dollars from strictly being used to fund public education to be funding both public education and private education entities, right? And so we've all seen this in the newspapers greatly. It's a huge, big deal. But I explain it the way I just explained it because there are a lot of different proposals related to this. There's the macro proposal. The big proposal for this legislative session is education savings accounts. The way that an education savings account will work is that if I have a child in public school, I can make an application to the Texas government and get part of my tax dollar, my property tax dollar, moved from the general revenue of the state of Texas and put into an education savings account with my name on it for me, okay? I would be able to use that money for educational purposes for my child, including tuition at a private school, educational programs as approved by the program, so tutoring or partial education programs, education-related expenditures as approved by the program. So for instance, I could potentially buy my kid a computer or technical supplies to do this thing with various limits, both expressed in the current bill and to be figured out by rule. But the main concept here is that instead of my tax dollars going to the public education system, prior to the time that they would be considered public money, this is according to the folks who like education savings account, they would be taken and sequestered in this account that I would be able to use. That would be a net loss of revenue to the public school system. The proponents of the bill argue it would be a net gain or a net loss of expense and liability to the public education system because my kid would be somewhere else and would not be taking up a seat at the school. And therein lies the argument. Would it really be a net gain for what? How would the public education system net? Would they really get that much less in their obligations and liabilities in the same proportion as they were losing the revenue when my money is taken out of the system, or a portion of my tax dollars are taken out of the system and put into this sequestered account for my use, right? And that is the argument. There are a lot of people, including a lot of faith communities here in Texas, that say, because of bucket number 1, the actual funding of our current structure, and the fact that that is generally inadequate and has less per pupil over the course of the last several years and lower per pupil than it was in 2011, that we need to fully fund public education before we start doing any of these things. And therefore, many faith organizations have taken, most lately in my experience, the Methodists and the Lutherans, who have developed their legislative agenda, have said, we don't think that public money should be used to fund private education by any particular agency, whether it's ESAs or a voucher or whatever, right? So that's an issue. However, you've got a very strong push that people say this would create innovation, and it would create competition, and it would create all of these good effects, and it would allow, most of all, it would allow children to get out of failing schools that they are trapped in, quote, by zip code, unquote, now, and be able to have real choice. The other side argues we have choice. We have a robust private school system. We have a robust charter system. This would take absolute core operating money out of the public school system and put it in these unproven private concerns. And then a huge part of the middle of that question, this is really important, is would public school style accountability go with the public dollars? And the answer at this point is no. That the private schools would be regulated in essence by their competition with other private schools, and therefore would not need the external concept of accountability. The opponents of these systems argue, come on, man, you can't send all that public money into the ether and expect competition to be the regulator of education quality for us. So it's robust, man. I love it, as you can tell. I really like the subject matter because it is complicated and interesting and super critical. But I bring all these things up. Because at the end of the day, when you say we're going to have our 20 to 25 minutes on pub ed, dang, it's worthy of at least 25 minutes for sure. And there's a lot in it. But I will also say this, that one of the things that's in play for public education, because it's what it is, because most of us have direct experience with it as students, many of us have direct experience with it as parents, all of us have direct experience with it as members of communities and families in Texas. There is a lot of community wisdom that should be expressed in this issue. You don't have to be an education scientist or a public policy wonk down here to know what your elementary or junior high or high school means to you and means in your community. And to know whether or not it's worthy of real consideration in public policy down here. So I think that's important. Sir, you had a question, bro?
Do you think something like maybe the private schools would invest more in advertising to the kids, or making it, really nice and sexy to get into the private schools rather than the education itself?
We don't know. And that's an interesting question. The question is whether or not private schools in a more competitive environment would invest in advertising and would invest in trying to get market share. If you listen to your radio now, if I listen to my radio in Austin, Texas, which I do because I'm a dinosaur, still listens to the radio, there are ads for private schools all over the place. That's alive and well and certainly happening right now. There's every kind of private school academy ad and private school. Interestingly, and this is something that I find, this is my particular criticism as someone who has worked in and around public education for a long time and thinks that public education is worthy of our strong effort in terms of helping it and improving it. One of the things I like is when a private school says, and there's one particular advertisement that says this, we don't teach to the test. Instead, we innovate and do all this stuff. To which I always say to myself in the shower or in my garage or in my car when I'm listening to the radio, do you think that the public school guys want to be teaching to the test? They are regulated such that they must, to some degree, teach to the test. And it's a reason for being issued for them because they will be severely punished and perhaps eliminated if they don't score on these tests. So the idea that public ed has just chosen for whatever reason to teach to the test, I think is somewhat mythological.
A lot of private schools cost a whole lot more than what we pay for, what we spend on children in public education.
Yes, ma'am.
How is that difference going to be made up? I mean, we've got a poor child in a failing school that wants to go to another public school, a private school, excuse me, what, I mean, is the money that
There is
costs to go to?
No.
You know that yet?
there is no provision in the bill to make up that difference.
So they're gonna get their $8,000 or whatever it is, and then they have to put that money into a school that costs $8,000.
Right, nor is there's no provision for making that up. There's no provision for transportation and related costs that might accrue. For instance, if you say we're going to have an ESA program, for instance, for $5,500 or $6,000 or $7,000, is there a provision for making up the tuition for the nearest private institution? The answer is no. Is there a provision for transportation to one you might be able to afford, or transportation to another one? The answer is no. That would be made up. That would be a choice of the families who would make it up. And this is also important, is there any kind of cost limitation or tuition regulation on the private schools if we pass this thing? And the answer is no. And so the question is, and a big cash infusion, a potential cash infusion into the private school marketplace constitute create an inflation in that tuition? And the answer is we don't really have the answer to that yet.
Second part of that question might be, if we wanted, if a parent wanted to send their child to the Catholic school, that's probably going to be Catholic, right?
Sure.
If a parent wanted to send their child to a Jewish school, that's probably going to be right. And our tax money go there.
Right.
If a parent wants to send their child to a Muslim school,
there's no prohibition of that in the bill, but you do bring up an interesting thing, which is public money for sectarian issues, right? This is often referred to, you will hear this in the media and in our materials and everything else, as a Johnson Amendment issue. There are, I'm sorry, I said Johnson Amendment, Blaine Amendment issue. There are several, I was thinking of the Johnson Amendment this morning, the Blaine Amendment issues, which say that you can't use public money for sectarian purposes. And the question is whether or not this would be defined as public money and then being used. Many public schools, for instance, have chapel that's required, or have religion classes that are required. And so there are potent questions about whether or not the Blaine Amendment would be, and we have this in the Texas Constitution, whether the Blaine Amendment would be violated by this. Now, that being said, the people who are against it tend to say the Blaine Amendment would be violated the first day, and the people who are for ESA system say it's not really public money, and no, the Blaine Amendment will be fine. This is being litigated in Nevada, for instance, which had an ESA program that's somewhat similar to the one that we're contemplating here in Texas. And so those issues would all be, that issue of equal treatment across various sectarian lines would be an important question, and the fundamental question of, does any sectarian ultimate reception of this money constitute a violation of the Blaine Amendment or not? This would also be in play. Sir?
How are the savings accounts to be funded? Do you send the money in, or do you just keep it out and not send that in when you pay your taxes on your house? Then are there audits on how those accounts will be spent to make sure that you're spending it all and not just going to Vegas or somewhere?
As the bill is contemplated now, the two questions. One is how would the money actually be moved and gathered? And the second is, would there be audits on the use of that money? The answer to the first question is, what you would have is you would pay your taxes like you pay them. But if you had a child of school age, you would make this election, and the state, out of the general revenue, out of money that would have gone into the education budget, will take that money out and put it in a separate account for you. So in essence, the state you would pay your tax dollars, but then you would have this.
So it goes to the state and then to the individual.
Right. So there wouldn't be like an offset or reduction on your taxes for the ESA program. No, it would go to the individual, and then you could decide to spend it on a school or whatever else, right? With regard to the audits, yes, there are provisions related to both an approved requirement for the expenditures, right? So I couldn't, for instance, say, I really want my kid to learn how to drive an Alfa Romeo sports car, and that's an educational thing, so I'm going to buy myself an Alfa Romeo sports car and let Junior drive it. Right. I mean, that would certainly not pass muster. And there are the sort of nuts and bolts of the bill have to do with having an administrator for this entire program hired by the state that would then, among other things, be required to conduct some level of random audit to make sure that people weren't abusing the privilege. That's the thing.
I'm just wondering, have other states tried this? I understood Michigan tried it.
There are limited programs in a couple of different states, and there are limited programs related to vouchers generally. In Louisiana, there's a limited Michigan experience. Probably the biggest ESA type experience, if you want to look at data associated with it, is in Chile, where they did this a couple of decades ago. I think 30 years ago, if I remember correctly. And there are a lot of sort of equity studies and stuff on Chile. However, it is hard to compare a place that goes through cycles of authoritarian regime, et cetera, to the great United States of America on this thing. So there are plenty of caveats associated with parallelism between that experience and what our experience would be.
So our public money is going to charter schools.
Right, but charter schools are technically public schools.
So this is separate.
Correct.
This is private.
Correct. This would be creating an education savings account, which then you as an individual could use for various, and one of the things that's important to recognize in this too is that people who choose to homeschool their children would have access to this concept and be able to create that account and use the expenditure again for approved educational purposes, potentially tutoring, co-op, educational activities, that kind of thing. Smith?
So you said it's hard to get more funding for public schools because it's so big. Well, just for a moment, coming off the defensive and going on the offensive, I have some ideas where I would like to take money from
Sure.
industries, but where do the public school components like the Lutherans and the Methodists work out their legislative agendas and also the teachers, where do they identify getting some more money into public schools?
I'm glad you asked. The question is, what are potential revenue sources for public schools? And I know I'm probably pretty close to an important event horizon here in terms of time. But one of the things to remember, and this is fundamental to your understanding of public school finance in Texas. A lot of times what you'll hear arguments about is public schools have all this money because property values have gone up so much. Right? So how many of you pay property tax in this room? How many of you pay more property tax than you paid 10 years ago? Right, sure. So a natural assumption would be that means public schools have more money if you're paying more property tax to your local ISD, right? But the way the funding mechanism works is that by and large, with certain small exceptions, but the majority of that money in increased valuation actually doesn't inure to your local district, it inures to the state. And it does so because of something called the guaranteed yield. Part of what the state does is the state puts in a certain amount of money to make sure that you get a certain amount of collections per student. If you exceed that guaranteed yield, then the state says, oh, we don't have to send you money anymore, right? So that's issue number one. Issue number two is the aforementioned Robin Hood, that if you're collecting more money per student, then you become that Chapter 41 school that exports your money. And so there's a certain leveling and a certain movement of the money in that system. But the net effect of much of the property valuation increase over the past many years here has been that the state actually has more money. So the good news for you as citizens of Texas is that you've got more money to do a balanced budget there, but you have to understand that anybody who tells you that public schools have benefited greatly from this increase in property valuations, this is not so. Our per pupil expenditures have actually gone down in the last several years. So you're paying more property taxes, but those property taxes may never be making it in the circle of life that is public education funding, they don't make it back to your district necessarily in the terms of increased dollars. Last one? Last one.
Two comments. As a Methodist, I think I can say that one of the sources that the Methodist legislature has identified is it's $10 billion for textile, for infrastructure.
Right.
Taking $5 billion of that, putting in public schools.
Right.
And I think that's a great idea personally. But the other thing, to follow up on his question, I'm a volunteer at Lucy Reed Creek Case School and I'm on the CAC.
Right.
And one of the things we talk about is how do we let more people know what a good school we are and what a good education we provide to 4 to 5-year-olds so that they don't all drop out of Lucy Reed and go to a charter school or a private school. And we don't know how to do that. I mean, we don't have any funding for advertising, but
Right.
it's a problem.
It is a problem. And I think that's part of your voice. If you want to talk about what you can do, I think one of the things that the legislature needs to hear in abundance, and other people for that matter, is if you think that your community schools are doing a good job with the resources that they're given and are working hard and are serving their community to the best of their ability, say it. And say it outside your community. Because what happens is people treat their school system sometimes like they treat their congressmen or their lawyers, or dare I say their lobbyists, which is ours good, but the rest of them are evil, right? You have to basically be ready to go and talk across community lines and say, we think that our school is doing a good job and we have faith that your school is doing a good job too, right? And that's important. There are some schools that need to be improved. I've never talked to a professional educator worth his or her salt who hasn't said, yeah, we can do better. My wife is an AP government teacher, and she had the highest scores that anybody knows of on record for the AP test. I'm quite proud of her, as you can tell. Glad I got to work her into this. She had a 94% pass rate on her AP test last year. She redid her curriculum entirely over the Christmas break to do better. So it's out there. The good work is out there. We need to say it.
But last year, Texas ranked 43rd. I'm looking at all the studies and saying an education dimension. And we were 49
In
per pupil spending.
per pupil spending.
And that's, to me, like the bottom.
Yeah, and which I find kind of interesting, right? Because those champions of sort of the marketplace would mostly agree you get what you pay for.
So where are you saying the money should come from?
The value of the money, I think the idea of making a priority over certain other state priorities is important. I think also a thing, and this is super important, there's always this concept of a bunch of you all raised your hands when you said you pay more in property taxes than you did last time. A common political response to that is, let's cut your property taxes, right? That reform that we had in 2006 was accompanied by a significant tax cut. The question is, what's more important at this juncture for you and the people of Texas? Is it cutting and there was a select committee on property tax relief through this last interim, and there will be proposals for property tax relief. The question is, given the state of public education in Texas, given the number 49, we can absolutely. There are many different ways that you could cut this apple, but the bottom line is, the question is this a time for big property tax relief in Texas? And I think a lot of the metrics in public education would say, yeah, the answer is no. And then the corresponding question of, is privatization of a bunch of the funds in public education a panacea that makes it so we can cut taxes and we'll get a result for our students? And a bunch of you are shaking your heads. So I know that this was sweeping and this is a lot of information, but I don't know any other way to talk about public education than a lot of information, and I've gone over time. And do you still want me to talk about now in the legislature? Or?
Yeah, give a couple quick words.
A couple of quick words about now in the legislature. And then this is switching off of pub ed into the general world of the legislature. The first 60 days of the legislature have certain limits on the activities associated with those days. This is because we're working off the 1876 Constitution, and it takes a long time to get here from El Paso on a horse. It's one of the quaint and wondrous things about our state constitution. But here's what's important. Only right now are committees starting to meet. A small set of committees in the House are having their first organizational meetings this week in Texas. So right now is the transition where we fall into the real meat of the legislative session, where you have committee meetings on bills, which will include public testimony, which will include your chance in a democracy to do the work, to go down to the Capitol and sign up and testify on bills. That's just starting right now. The last day of bill filing is March 10th. Right now we have, give or take, I haven't looked at the number this morning, but something like 3,000 bills filed in the legislative session. By March 10th, if we follow historical norms, we'll have about 6,000 bills filed in the legislative session. Now begins the avalanche of bills. So we know about half in terms of bill text of what we will know about this legislative session. A lot of the bills that get filed between now and then are, oh, I guess we'll file one, but we're not serious about it bills. A lot of bills that get filed between now and then are bills that have been waiting for this moment to be filed, and they're really big deal. So you cannot evaluate the relative importance of a bill by its number. So be vigilant. Watch all of the resources that you have, including Texas Impact stuff, because there are going to be lots and lots of instruments coming up in the legislative session. And begin to look at the schedule for committee hearings, because that is one of the best ways that you can actually petition government, is by taking the time and effort and your personal resources to go down to the legislature and sign up and testify on a bill. So that is where we are.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Beaman.